Democrats, you know this man, Charles Booker. I know you're sitting there going, who's Charles Booker? I remember the name, but I'm not quite sure why. I'm going to help you out. It starts with this person. This is Amy McGrath. I know y'all remember Amy McGrath. Every Democrat remembers Amy McGrath. She was the officially sanctioned Democrat who ran against Mitch McConnell in a race for his Senate seat in Kentucky in 2020. Amy McGrath was backed by the Democrat Senatorial Campaign Committee. Amy McGrath was backed by Chuck Schumer. She amassed a war chest that can justifiably be called cosmically gigantic. She raised $96 million in that campaign. She outraised Mitch McConnell by, I think, over $30 million, and then she lost. Not by a little, by a lot. Over 400,000 votes, to be exact. Despite all of the money, Amy McGrath barely even survived the Democratic primary to be the Democrat to go up against Mitch McConnell. And that's because in the last few weeks of the primary race, somebody was suddenly breathing very heavily down her back, and that person was, you guessed it, Charles Booker. Now you're kind of remembering who Charles Booker is, right? Charles Booker became suddenly hot for the entire month of June 2020. Google any news items about Amy McGrath in June of 2020, and you're gonna hear how Charles Booker is rapidly closing the gap. He was suddenly shaking up what should have been, or what was supposed to be, a very easy nomination for McGrath. Charles Booker was never not the underdog, but with all of the money that McGrath had brought in, I know that Chuck Schumer had to be sitting there looking at the tight race and going, why is it even this close? McGrath ultimately eked out the primary win, but it was so close between her and Charles Booker that it took an entire week after the primary was done to finally declare the winner. That's how close it was. So Charles Booker ultimately did not win the primary to go up against Mitch McConnell, but he did win the moment. And he won a sizable, dedicated following, and he clearly had the momentum that McGrath had hoped for and was supposed to have, but was nowhere to be found. And now Charles Booker is preparing to launch another campaign for the other Kentucky Senate seat, and that one belongs to Senator Rand Paul, a close ally of ex-President Thumbhead. And, you will remember this. He was confronted by protesters after he attended Thumbhead's convention speech in 2020. Insert video here. Now, as we all continue to argue over what kind of Democrat can win statewide in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, is it going to be a moderate Democrat? Do we need a progressive Democrat? There's really only one kind of Democrat who can win right now in Kentucky, and that is the right Democrat. And that is the candidate that the actual people within the Commonwealth of Kentucky are saying they want. All of us in all the other states can and should support Democrats in states other than our own, but we don't get to vote. It's the people of Kentucky who vote. And those people were clearly saying that Charles Booker was the candidate they wanted to go up against McConnell in 2020. Booker came on so late that McGrath was doing huge with the early mail-in voting, but Booker was catching up. I propose that if there had been another week of campaigning, Booker would have made enough of an impact to overcome the advantage that McGrath had with the early mail-in ballots and would have cinched that primary victory. Charles Booker is a native of Louisville, Kentucky. He was raised in one of the poorest zip codes in the city. Breonna Taylor, that's a name you probably know, was also from Louisville, Kentucky. If you don't recall the name, Breonna Taylor was the woman who was killed by plainclothes police officers who burst into her home, forced their way in, and then proceeded to fire off 30 plus bullets, 6 of which hit Breonna Taylor and killed her. Only one of those officers was indicted on any kind of charge, and that charge was only wanton endangerment. That's what it's called, and it was referring to bullets that had strayed into a neighbor's house and endangered them. It had nothing to do with the death of Breonna Taylor. No one was indicted for the death of Breonna Taylor. Knowing what we know about the rage that has consumed this country in cities both Republican and Democrat, including my city of Portland, Oregon, and numerous days of protests in Louisville, Kentucky, with no police officer being held responsible for Breonna Taylor's death. Knowing all of that, if you watch this specific answer from Amy McGrath while she was still campaigning, you can see that despite all of the money in the world trying to convince us otherwise, Amy McGrath was clearly not the candidate who was ever going to meet the moment. Take a look.
Have you been on the ground in Louisville with the protesters the last 3 days, or in Lexington or elsewhere? Ms. McGrath.
I have not.
And why?
Well, I've been with my family, and I've had some family things going on this past weekend, but I've been following the news and, and watching and making sure that, I think we're in the middle of a pandemic. So we also have to look at, is that the place to be right now? So that's really why.
I stand before you as your brother, as your cousin, as your neighbor, as your fellow good troublemaker. My name is Charles Booker.
They called us a long shot. Said the movement in Kentucky was impossible. But man, we proved them wrong. As we made our stand together, I could not have imagined the new world we were about to step into. The height of racial tension, the pandemic, and insurrection. While Kentuckians lost their livelihoods and homes, a handful of privileged politicians chose to continue criminalizing poverty. While our loved ones were brutalized, they chose to do nothing. That's why today I'm formally announcing an exploratory committee for U.S. Senate. We will transform Kentucky. And Rand Paul, you know it too.
Charles Booker is for the Green New Deal. Charles Booker is for abortion rights. Charles Booker is for legalizing cannabis. Racial and economic justice are top issues in his campaign. Charles Booker, you do know him, see? He wants to defeat Rand Paul and become the next U.S. Senator from Kentucky. You can find out more about him right now at charlesbooker.org. And that's it for me. Don't forget you can watch all of my candidate profiles at YouCantBeatBlue.com and at the Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/YouCantBeatBlue. Don't forget, midterms start now. Find your candidates and start supporting them. I'll see you next time. Gary out.